Welcome back, part two. Let's talk about, first of all, where we are in the state of Oregon. So Oregon was one of the very last states to adopt state standards. We don't have state taxes. There wasn't a lot of money invested, and we're a little on the rogue side, no pun intended. So between Montana, which is a similar state, and Oregon, we really joined the game late. How standards were developed initially is we looked at, much like we did in our class, at the end of high school, what do students need to know, do, and be able to understand? So at the State Department level, those that were really involved in teaching the different disciplines, there's a lot of work done to get there. They created outcomes by the end of high school that everybody would be able to do. From there, they created benchmarks, and we have three main benchmarks in addition to the graduation. We have the first benchmark, third grade. Or actually, let's start backwards. The first benchmark that they created, third benchmark, they said by eighth grade, in order to graduate with this knowledge, what do students need to know and be able to do? And then by fifth grade, where should they all be? And by third grade, where should they all be? So the first benchmark is third grade, the difference between learning to read versus reading to learn. Fifth grade, really getting that foundational content and ready for middle school. Eighth grade, where do they need to do before they jump into high school? And then again, high school graduation. We still have the benchmarks, although these are now called benchmark years, where we do assessments to make sure folks are actually where they should be at the time. And then we have LESTED curriculum. Again, the reason we have state standards and accountability really had to do with issues of equity, that depending on where someone was living really depended on the opportunities they were given and what they were taught. And that was something, although it still exists, not to the degree that it did before. So in the state of Oregon, we started with benchmark years. When I first came on here, most of this, which was less than 20 years ago when I moved to Oregon, I think we only had two that were actually from the benchmark years brought down to the state, the grade level standards. We still have some of our disciplines that are working right now and refining those grade level standards, but most of them we have grade level standards. We also have some of the very worst, poorly written standards. There used to be a joke that if you can read Oregon standards, you can teach anywhere. That has been improved greatly because every 7 years, a content area standards are refined and revised. So every 7 years, that will be on the midterm and the final, they go through a revision process. So every year there is some discipline that is in the revision process. And with that comes new textbooks adoptions, and we'll go into more of that when we're back together in person. So the next thing I want to talk about really, though, has to do with time, coverage, breadth versus depth, and its impact on how we do what we do. This is working with, if you're teaching in a public K-12 classroom in the state of Oregon, you're teaching in a state that has some of the very least instructional days in our country. And there's been a lot on the news, there's been a lot of studies that have shown that we have more required standards and hours to teach than we have hours to teach them in. So we have some math upside down. In a study done in the called Prisoner of Time, and this was back quite a while, that was saying, hey, there's 15,000 hours of standards that are required to teach, and yet the schools only have 9,000 hours to teach them in. How is that working? Most schools states have adjusted. In Oregon, we are really at a disadvantage that we have some of the least hours of instructional time to teach quite a lot of standards. And one of the things that our revisions are doing, instead of having 50 standards in science that we have to go through, and literally breadth means what the full span of knowledge we have to teach, versus depth means really learning and deep knowledge. We would take our poor little kids and grab them by the back of the neck and bounce them as fast as we could over all of these standards, resulting in not very much depth of knowledge. And so knowing how the brain works and knowing that internationally we have other countries would have 4 or 5 standards in science that they would cover in topics, and we would have 15 to actually sometimes up to 40 that we would try to cover. There's been a lot of shifts, and that's where our new generation science standards come from. So when you're looking at our Oregon State standards, you're going to find that the science standards, those are the excellent ones. They are written around big ideas. Less is more. I'm going to say that again, less is more, and that allows students to do deep learning. So tonight you will be the homework for this week will be to really look at the Oregon State standards, having feedback from folks. It looks like the number that won again this quarter is third grade. So we're going to look at third grade standards, regardless of what grade you might want to teach, or even if you want to teach in public schools. Regardless, there are standards or goals that you're going to be asked to meet. So if it's going to be working in national parks, if it's going to be working in a museum, if it's going to be working in higher education, you still have, what are the goals? What do you want your students walking away knowing, doing, and understanding? What we'll be talking about and learning and using the rest of this class is how to do that. So we're going to practice that with third grade standards, but the process is going to be the same regardless. Let's take a look just for a moment more, though, around the importance of, not very good at this, the importance of intentional teaching. And for the purpose of really knowing that we have so many standards to teach, how do we do that? We want to highlight the importance of intentionality. When you look at the Oregon school calendar, you're going to know that for most schools, they start in, a lot of states, they'll start in August. We don't, right? We don't start at all until the very maybe last day in August or last half week. And what happens in that week? Not a lot of intentional teaching. It's a lot of how do you live in this classroom, introductions. I'd argue you can do both, but that's another conversation. We have winter break. We've got conferences. There's everything from Thanksgiving break. We have a lot of 3-day weekends. There's spring break. Don't forget testings. That often can take up to 2 weeks of instructional time. And our students tend to get out pretty early in the calendar year towards mid to late June. So in terms of our teaching days, it is a resource that for Oregon teachers, it becomes a critical issue. We have the very least amount to work with. The next thing I really want to focus on here is back to that idea, if everything's important, nothing's important. So that intentional teaching of big ideas, really making it clear, what is it you want your students to understand? So as you begin to look at the state standards, some are created, they're not all created equal. Our science standards are very well done. Our social studies standards are just in their stage of revision, so they're just hot off the press. But you'll see other areas that it really is upon the educator to discern, we'll pull it together, well, what's the big idea? So we start with the standard and we say, okay, in that standard, what is it that I want my students to walk away with? And we do that with cognition and learning. Big ideas, sometimes they'll be referred to as learning goals, sometimes they're referred to as generalizations. We're going to be referring them as enduring understandings, and you'll get some more information and a chance to have a better understanding of what those are, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce it today, and in the homework you'll have a chance to look at a video and see more examples and be asked to actually start the process. So we know that, number one, they help students make sense of the world around them. We're constantly seeking patterns and we're seeking sense making. So it works with how our brains work. It allows students to think of it as a giant piece of Velcro. A big idea helps connect facts and skills in a meaningful way that's transferable and allows students to use those. They allow us to apply and transfer new learning. They stick facts to patterns. So that's the big purpose behind our big idea. With so many standards and with such little time and wanting to have making meaning, sense making, and depth of learning, we're going to be looking at how do you do that? How do you connect ideas in a purposeful and relevant way for your students? So again, big idea, enduring understanding, same thing. It's a statement that helps describe, explain, predict, and control this experience. It refers to important ideas, concepts, principles, and it helps make sense in this particular curriculum, but more importantly, it's transferable into the real world. Some examples of this from our own Oregon State standards are, and again, it's a statement, so I encourage you to begin with the sentence starter. Students will understand that. That'll help semantically frame your sentence in a way that would work for your curricular units that you develop, again, whether it's K-12 or outside in the workforce. So out of our state standards in Oregon, we could say, well, students will understand what? They're going to understand that unbalanced forces causes changes in motion. You'll notice that there's these concepts, changes, relationships, interdependence, systems. These are concepts that allow students to transfer some of the big ideas from different disciplines, and it's also developmentally. So when you think of a third grader, there's a lot of things that are important for third graders. Relationships is a major important thing, right? It's all about their friend group and whose birthday party they're going to, and it's relationships from making a sense of their tight family unit to it's starting to broaden now with their school community. Change is another really big one that's occurring for our fifth graders and fourth graders, right? Their bodies are changing, the world's changing. So these are big concepts that help connect ideas. And you'll see a list of concepts under the resources for the course that you will be using and will be working with next week. So here's a list of again, some examples of big ideas. The universe is affected by various forms of energy flowing throughout all systems. These aren't facts. These aren't a list of truisms. These are ideas that one has to uncover. So again, this is the depth of your unit, not the breadth. These generalizations, they address, we could look at this from kindergarten, you can get your PhD in this. So the list of concepts you'll see here, these are nouns that connect, and we'll be building on those. The homework for this week that will be due next week, and this is in addition to what we're doing in lieu of meeting today face-to-face because of this crazy weather, is to read chapter 5, but really focus in on pages 82 to 88, and that's the new edition. So if you picked up an older edition, you'll want to focus in on unit design and big ideas. You don't need to go into the lesson planning. We'll be talking more about that later. So really focusing in on unit ideas, the first part of the chapter. There is a short article on understanding what's the big idea and understanding by design and overview, and then 2 short videos. What you're going to be doing is 2 things for the class. One is bringing in to the class a write-up, just an outline of notes of the reading and the videos. You'll be able to use that in class for an in-class quiz. And the second thing, and this is where we start making curriculum, I want you to get in, look at the state standards for 3rd grade, and figure out, well, what do 3rd graders learn? You'll see direction specific and resources for that assignment under the assignment file. You're required to post if you want to receive full credit and bring a hard copy to class. If you click on the, so this is where you'll post your notes. You're going to bring a hard copy to class. You don't actually have to post the notes. The second thing here, though, is to, let me pull this up. Here's a link to the 3rd grade standards and an example of what you'll do. So you're going to do the exact same thing I did here. You're going to be looking at your English language arts, math, science, and social studies standards. And you're going to think about what's a major unit topic that's taught. Not like for math, I wouldn't say geometry per se. I'd think of like shapes and patterns, or for science, again, it's not Earth systems, it's a topic, weather and climate around the world. So think about what 3rd graders learn. and then you're going to you'll support that by looking at what standard and writing it exactly in this format.